All right. When I was living in Toronto, I didn't really ever imagine I would be speaking here. Yes, my name is Guillaume. I've been working for independent developers for 16 years now, so uninterrupted independent development. I've been a programmer, a technical artist, a producer, a creative director, a studio agent, a janitor, and now I run a small studio in Montreal called Compulsion. I also hate public speaking. Has anyone here ever had to face television cameras? Raise your arms if you've ever had to face television. Well, that's a lot of people. Okay, so for people who are a little bit more introverted, like I am, facing cameras was something that I managed to avoid for most of my career. So for the first 15 years of my career, I did everything except go and talk in public and go and talk in front of cameras. And then something funny happened when I decided to build my studio and create my own game. I realized I had to actually face the cameras for the first time. So to introduce the subject of my talk, I'm going to show you a little bit of a video and I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story.
Contrast is being made by Compulsion Games, an indie developer with a very original idea.
You play the imaginary friend of a little girl. She's escaping a rather harsh reality with regards to her family. She's going through some heavy stuff. It's set in the 1920s. Her parents are both in the performing arts. Her mother is a cabaret singer. Her father's organizing a circus. And so you spend most of the game helping the little girl cope or resolve family issues that she goes through.
This is one story that is very close to his heart.
Because I'm a parent. I have two little girls who are 4 and 9, and I wanted to make a story that felt true to what they felt.
How'd you go through shadows?
It's a puzzle platform, so part of the game has to do with is more puzzle oriented, where you can actually manipulate light sources or manipulate shadow casters to change the shadow landscapes on which you're going to be able to traverse later. Another part of the game is more platform oriented, where we're really trying to get people to think in multiple dimensions while they're platforming. So because you can platform in 2 spaces at once, you can do things like jump in the 3D world and catch yourself on the ledge of a shadow if there's nothing that's physical that can catch you. So again, it's a different experience. We're trying to drive to a different experience in both the platforming genre and the puzzle genre.
Being an indie game developer often means sacrifice, personally and financially.
You have to give everything away. It's personal, but my finances, yeah.
All right. I want to freeze on that frame. So, I've been preparing very nervously for my first day with the media, and we're in Boston. I really hate this mic. Can I speak? Do you guys hear me if I speak at this distance?
Yep.
All right. And I've been preparing for the media, and I've been a little bit nervous, and I've had a few media interviews at that point. But then NBC television rolls out with the big televisions and starts asking me questions about the game. So I stand up bravely in front of the cameras and answer questions from the guy. After 3 minutes, he stops asking me questions about my game and starts asking me questions about my kids, about my finances, about my personal life. So in this very frame, I am really fucking angry. You can't actually see it. I'm trying to smile to the camera, but I'm really fucking angry. And the funny thing is, when the conference finished, I went out and we were flying straight to GDC, and I was telling to my teammates, it's like, oh, this fucking interview with the NBC guy, I don't know, it's gonna be terrible. And it turned out to be the best, or one of the best interviews that I gave about the game. And one of the reasons for it is that the interviewer had actually pulled me out of my shell. I still told him to fuck off.
More than I'm willing to tell on camera, but...
So, I'm not going to tell you the story of the hardships that we had on Contrast, because for me, first of all, that's a story that you say around beers with friends, and We've all heard numerous stories about independent developers having a hard time. That's exactly what was going through my head at that point. All right, so on that, I got my start in games. I got my start programming demos when I was 17, actually. While I was going to say a few stories, I was going to show you something that I showed very, very few people, and people that know me well, which is my first portfolio piece when I was 17. It's pretty ugly. And I'm going to take the sound off this one. So I got my start programming demos in the 90s. So this is one of the first demos I did when I was, I think I was 15 or 16, writing assembly code. And back in the day, I was with one of my good friends, Danny, who works at Ubisoft now, like most people on planet Earth who make games these days. And we were doing all kinds of shit, like applying to ID software and all these crazy software companies. This was before there was any video game companies in Montreal. This is really ugly, by the way. I just wanted something to show while I was saying this story. And one of the places that I applied to was Shiny Entertainment. And the guy that was running it, his name was Dave Perry. He actually runs one of the studios at Sony now. And I spent quite a bit of time writing back to me and explaining to me how to get into the industry. So he wrote entire page emails over and over for weeks at a time to give me counsel on how to get into the industry. And when I finally got my start in the industry, I sent him an email and I said, look, Dave, I finally made it to the big leagues. I'm now working for this big, huge developer in Toronto called Pseudo Interactive. We're working on a small game. And one of the things he told me is basically that he advised at that point was just to pay it forward. And I think that's a little bit why during my first years in Toronto I got so involved with the community here. I'm really happy to be back, by the way. It's been a long time since I've been here. So what I want to tell you tonight is a couple of lessons that I've learned throughout my indie years, not just on Contrast, but through the various studios that I worked at. And give you guys a little bit of a glimpse on the little wisdom that the little bits of wisdom that I acquired along the way. The first game that I worked on, not shut down Windows. I can just speak really loudly. Can you guys hear me if I speak really loudly? So the first game that I worked on was called Sail Damage.
Woo.
Yeah. I'm going to show you the original trailer, not the new one.
Don't try this at home!
There was a few things about Sail Damage that we really liked at the time. Part of it was this So a few things I liked about Sail Damage back at the time. It was a different project because we had stretch and squash physics and cartoon rendering, and I happened to be the one writing the rendering system, so I was really, really, really proud. And then we were the only cel-shaded game on the market. It was the big thing that we were doing that was different. And then 3 months before we shipped, there's another game that was called Jet Brand Radio that shipped that had cel shading and was recognized as the people who started cel shading. And this is something that's happened to me several times in my career that I've recognized is that good ideas generally don't happen by themselves. They generally happen to several people all at the same time. One of the other things that most people don't know is that Sail Damage was actually a first-party title signed by Microsoft. I'm allowed to say that now, right, Dan? It's been how many years? I can say anything I want. So Cell Damage was actually a first-party Microsoft title. Microsoft had signed Sudo to make a launch title for the new console that they were launching. So it was a very, very prestigious assignment for the studio, especially for a small studio at the time, to be making a game for basically the hardware launch of a new console from a new player. And it being Microsoft, it needed to be family-friendly, a nice family-oriented game for kids that, you know, the whole family would enjoy. So we made Mickey Mouse runs around in a car. It was the perfect game for the perfect market. And then we were working happily and happily and happily. And then one day, the VP of marketing from Microsoft, I remember, walks into the shop. And she walks into the big boardroom. She has no freaking clue what game we're making. And she comes into the game, and comes into the boardroom, assembles the entire team, and says, I'm going to give you the spiel about how we're going to market the Xbox so that you guys can understand where we're going with the marketing on the Xbox, and you can be part of the team. And then she showed us this app. I'm going to show it to you now.
What the hell?
Kind of the sound we had in our heads about our game at that point. Now, the funniest thing is that this lady didn't even know what we were working on. And she gave her whole spiel. She showed us all the cool, edgy marketing materials that they were going to do. And she spent the entire time telling us she was going to be appealing to 18 to 32-year-olds. Really 16 to 32-year-olds, but she didn't want to advertise anyone under 18. And I remember the entire room fell silent at that point because we were making a game for Microsoft. We were a first-party title. We're supposed to be making games that are in line with the frickin' marketing direction of Microsoft. So it's a little surprised that. So I mean, the team's reaction at that point. This is a very traditional, typical type of story that I've seen and witnessed in independent video game development, and. The team's reaction at that point was they freaked out. I freaked out. And we tried to figure out ways, because we had our little Mickey Mouse characters that are, you know, walking around and bumping around, their little, you know, wiggly tails. And we tried to figure out ways that we could somehow try to bend the game to fit the vision that Microsoft had for it. So we switched our characters. And we figured, okay, we're going to do a little bit Ren and Stimpy. In fact, Dominatrix, which is one of the characters that made it into the final game, had a cutscene that was so into her dominatrix persona that the ESRB told us that we would get a mature rating if we kept it. So we ended up having to replace it. You can still hear the whip sounds in the actual cutscenes if you pay attention to it. So that's a small story. Obviously, for those that don't know already, Cell Damage is being redone right now by some of the original members of the team, and it's just released on the PS4. But yeah, it's to come to the story, and you're going to get a sense for it, as I'm trying to paint a picture of what independent development meant in the earlier parts of the last decade, and how it's changed today in terms of my experience running Compulsion. So as the years grew, I eventually became a lead programmer within Sudo, and then the partners, and I worked on a title called Pariah with the folks at Digital Extremes Toronto, back when there was a Toronto office. And the mainstream portion of the team was working on our flagship title, Full Auto. So the studio between Sail Damage and Full Auto grew from 12 to approximately 50, 55 people. And I'd been really kind of sequestered on a smaller team, working with 2, 3 people on a smaller team. And until the point in time where the partners came to see me and said, Guillaume, we're in trouble. Would you like to come and take over the production and management reign? So again, I'm going to talk about in many different points in my experience, having worked for independent developers has forced me to face my fears, and has forced me to kind of get out of my shell and try things that I wasn't comfortable with. And for me, this was one of the pivotal moments in which I had to really get out of my shell and realize that I had to do something that I hadn't done before. So for those that don't know Full Auto, I'll show you just a quick teaser. So obviously, we're operating in a different league at this point. So it's funny because here I am managing my little pump team with 3 or 4 guys, and then the next day I'm managing 60 guys, guys and girls. We had girls on the team as well. It was a real moment of shitting your pants for me. At the ripe old age of 26, suddenly I'm managing 3 times as many people. And one of the biggest thing that I had in my mind in terms of reacting, because I didn't have any formal training on how to manage a large team, or a largest team, was that if the team didn't believe we could make a date, then we were not going to make the date. It's one thing, if your team believes that they can make a date, then you may need to do some cuts, but you'll get to the finish line. If they don't believe it, then dragging them all the way across the finish line is generally a pretty bloody affair. So I sat down with every team member at the time trying to figure out where the blockages were, and I did something that was a little you can see English is my second language, something that wasn't quite orthodox at the time, which was to get out of MS Project. Yes, there was a time where we did schedule games with MS Project. And I hung up these 2 huge white cardboards in the entrance of the studio. And let me see if I can stand. Maybe Rob Ford's really short. Okay, I feel better. So I put up these big cardboards at the entrance of the studio, and I actually laid out the schedule with sticky notes, and I had a different color sticky notes for each department. This is a very well, I mean, a lot of studios use this trick now, but back then it was revolutionary. The other thing that I did is I put it on the entrance, so each time that the team members would get into the studio, they'd see the schedule every morning and see the progress on the schedule every morning. We shipped on time. We shipped that project about a week after the launch of the 360, so it was a pretty big title for us to ship. Shipping it again on a hardware launch. Again, I make my career of doing the hardware launches. Was it one of my biggest achievements, and perhaps also one of the studio's biggest strategic mistakes. And I want to talk about this. I wanted to address this in Toronto. When I was asked to come talk in Toronto, I said, well, I'm going to make a talk in Toronto about Toronto, at least in part, because there's certain things I did want to address. When I know I've worked with a number of studios in Ontario that have shut their doors, and when I speak to people, I often get dismissive answers about, oh, this studio closed for that reason, or this studio closed for that reason, or they were lacking this thing. Whether it's Silicon Knights, whether it's Bedlam, whether it's Pseudo, whether it's Julian's studio, I always get the dismissive answer of, oh, they didn't have this magic pudding. Well, I run a studio now, and I can tell you it is no simple affair, and it's a lot fucking easier today than it was back then, for a couple of reasons. And the thing that is important for anyone who's considering running a studio of that size to consider is those are really smart people. And it's not because they are missing a piece of pudding or made some fatal mistake along the way that the studio's closed. It's because in the disc-based era of independent development, and by disc-based I mean the only way to get a game out there is to sign a publishing deal and actually get a disc published through a distributor. We were all in a spiral loop of growing bigger and bigger and bigger at each product cycle. And keeping up was an extremely difficult thing. Pseudo closed not because they weren't doing a good job, they closed because some bean counter at IDOS needed to cut 200 million, and their project was at the start, not at the end of the production cycle. All right, so I don't know, how many studio heads is there in the room right now? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Can we get a round of applause for them? It's hard work. Whether the studio's alive or not, we owe the people who started studios in Ontario, whatever you think of them, some of them are very divisive leaders, but we owe them the time and the effort that they took in building the Ontario community. It's pretty fucking traumatic to close a studio. All right, so on towards my journey. So I went from Toronto. I wasn't here for the Pseudo closure. I went to see my boss, Richard, about 6 months before leaving, and I told him, my wife wants to go to Europe. I'm going to Europe. And I went out and interviewed with a few studios at the time, and I went and chose a small studio in Lyon called Arcane Studios, and they were working on a super secret project that I'm not allowed to talk about publicly even 7 years afterwards.
Welcome to another GameSpot News Update. I'm Caroline Pettit. Screenshots from Dishonored developer Arcane Studios' Half-Life 2 Episode 4, or Return to Ravenholm, have surfaced. Valve Time has posted a batch of images it claims are verified and stem from development in 2006 and 2007. The images show off series familiar environments and art style. Notably, a HUD element called absorption is present in the screenshots, though it is not clear what this could mean. This is not the first time Arcane's Half-Life game Return to Ravenholm has been discussed. A year ago, Valve writer Mark Laidlaw told Lambda Generation that such a project was in development at the studio. He said some ideas were discussed between Valve and Arcane, but ultimately the project was scuttled. For all the latest news on Half-Life 2 Episode 4, and let's hope there is more news, subscribe to GameSpot News on YouTube and visit GameSpot.com.
Sorry, Caroline, there is no more news. So I'm not going to give more details about that project, other than, and especially because I do respect Raph a lot, and I know he's quite secretive about what his studio's worked or has worked on, and he gets sniffed on a lot by the press for it. But it was funny for me because I flew out and literally chose the absolute most opposite studio on the planet I could find from Pseudo. Pseudo was a technically strong studio. We were well organized, the production team was strong, and we liked making tech demos and hardware launches. Arcane was literally run by the art director and the creative director. There was no producer and there was no tech director. So from just a purely cultural shift on the corporate level, I was diving into a completely different environment. add to that fact, the fact that it's a studio that was on a different continent, operating in a different language with a number of different people that came from different countries in Europe, and suddenly it was like really throwing myself in a hot bath to go and try to be a producer in a shop that never had a producer before. It was in 9 months, in the 10 months that I was there, I gained more experience than in several years that came before that. And I also came 5 weeks before the super secret project got canceled. So moving my family to another continent to produce what was going to be a huge title and falling on my seat and realizing that we were now in crisis mode because there's not a single dollar going into the company, but we have 2 studios on 2 continents, was somehow a situation that I found familiar with working with independent developers. So I spent most of my time at Arcane pitching a completely different project that you may have heard about called The Crossing.
France is collapsing under the weight of its own government. In Paris's ghettos, anarchy. 2 realities are about to collide. What if the Knights Templar had survived 1307?
We would never sign it. I spent 10 months pitching it to every European publisher. Raph spent those same 10 months pitching it to every American publisher, and we separated the continents that way. I just want to really emphasize how difficult it was for independent developers to sign original intellectual properties back then. When you were an indie developer, you made other people's IP, and in order to sign high-profile IP, even one of the best teams in the world, I mean, they were the best team in the world last year, or 2 years ago with Dishonored, was struggling to actually develop their own IP. They'd effectively lost control over their business process. And I don't say this in any disregards to Arcane, because it's definitely one of the best teams I've ever worked with. But I saw the same patterns that were developing at Arcane that had been at Pseudo, which is at one point when you lose control over your destiny. And by that, I mean the ability, the time, and the money to actually do the projects that you want to do, you've lost the initiative. And in most of the studio closures that I've seen in the indie world, that's where it starts. When you lose the initiative about how much time and money you can spend in order to actually create something that's your own, at a level of quality that you want to reach, that's when it's time to dial it back. Again, these are some of the biggest things that I brought to the forefront of my thought process before starting my own studio. But I can tell you that when I left Arcane, I was pretty disillusioned about independent development. I've been working on it I had been working in it for 10 years at that point in time, and I just didn't see an actual future in it in the way that the industry was going. 2008 happened to be when Raid came out in Castle Crashers, and when we started getting titles that had some level of success that were distributed digitally. Even though it was still under the walled gardens of the console space, it was really the first time that I started realizing that there might be a future for independent gaming if we could get rid of those fucking discs. Sorry for my language. because suddenly it was possible for us to make games that didn't have to sell for $69.99 in the store. You didn't need a 200-man team, and you didn't need to prove that you were the best studio on the planet to sign them. So for the people who are indie today, I really wanted to bring back that forth, that being indie back then was being it was a little bit hard to get out of the second-class citizen stage. There's a few people that did it. I can see one right in front of me right now. But they're rare and far between. Generally, they were very small studios that were just signing on their sales. And then I had an original idea. I'm not going to talk about the process for Contrast for very long, because I know you all want beer and we had a little bit of a slow start. But I want to talk a little bit about where the idea came from, how it developed, and what were the hurdles for it. So I had the original, I'm just going to pull the original design document I wrote for it in 2008. Whitney's not going to like them showing this. Okay, so these were the first slides about the idea of contrast, and it really started with a mechanic. I was working in Lyon at the time, and I was working for a developer called Bedlam in Toronto at the time. And since I was in France, they'd wake up at 3:30 in the afternoon. So, is there an issue? So I had a lot of free time in the morning, and one of the things I used to do is I used to scribble in my books for ideas and whatnot, and that's the point in time where I really developed the first idea for Contrast, is the idea that I could go in and out of shadows in order to manipulate objects, and really the idea stemmed from there. And in the meager weeks that I'd worked with Valve had been closing the Orange Box, so I'd witnessed the filing of the Portal at the time, and I'd been very inspired by the idea that you could take one mechanic and reuse it and make something that was interesting. So this is really where the first ideas of Contrast came about. It wasn't about the visuals of it, it wasn't about the story of it, it was mostly about like the core mechanic that I wanted to develop around it. So I moved to Montreal and decided I was going to start a studio because it looked like I hadn't eaten enough shit, trying to do independent development in my career. I had to try it for myself. I moved in the beginning of 2009, which, if some of you remember, happens to be when the entire world went into economic crisis as well. So. Here I am moving continents with 2 children. One of them was 3 months. No money. I didn't know a single person in Montreal. And I would quickly discover that in Montreal, being indie was not very hip. In fact, being indie was where all the resumes went to die and where all the students learned how to make games. That's a very different ecosystem than Toronto. And at the beginning, this is a little bit of a hurdle, and trying to explain to the community in Montreal that yes, you could make serious games and still be an indie. It wasn't some crazy thing. I wasn't making a work for hire shop. But I did want to take things slowly. And by slowly, I meant I wanted to take control over my business process. So taking control over my business process means that I would slave myself away doing contract work, accumulate money, and then take risks, and then repeat the process until I got into where I needed. And the first risk I did was to hire Whitney. It was a 22-year-old, I think you were 22, 21. 21-year-old concept artist from university to try to help draft like the visuals for it. And I wasn't in a hurry because I figured I can just take my time. I don't know if Reagan and Mir are here from Metanet, but they made a talk a couple of years ago and about the Rock Band way of making video games, and their whole business model was titled Don't Go Bankrupt. And for all its simplicity, I wouldn't say that that was my ultimate goal of not going bankrupt, but for all its simplicity, that was the basics of it, is that I wanted to be able to accumulate enough money so that I felt comfortable taking risks. And I think when it comes to any size of a project in the video games industry, your willingness to take, whether it's creative risks or product risks or marketing risks, is entirely based upon your capability of assuming the consequences of those risks. I also wanted to create a culture where I could have my employees be really, really involved. I call it a culture of success, a culture in which the employees are just as convinced as you are that you need to succeed. And that didn't happen until we got money from the Canadian Media Fund. So one of the people on Threads mentioned that we got money from the Canadian Media Fund. You're very, very lucky in Ontario because you've got Kim. Where's Kim? Hey, Kim, stand up. Stand up. Stand up. All right, so now that I'm behind the mayor's office, I can make comments about your tax credits and your systems and our tax credits. But seriously, the OMDC offers something in Ontario that is severely lacking in Quebec. And in fact, most of the independent developers in Quebec have been heavily lobbying the government, because we're very good at lobbying the government in Quebec. But heavily lobbying the government to change that, because the biggest problem that I had starting the studio was there was no access to capital. Your tax credits in Ontario are all fucked up. You gotta wait 16 months for them, but only the big studios really care about them. When you're really starting out, what you need is capital. And it was one of the things that I have really, really struggled when I started the studio. So over the first 2.5 years of running the studio, I spent most of my time working my fucking ass off so that I could actually pay other employees to work on the title I wanted to work on. And that was a little bit the reality of the first 2 years of the studio. I'm going to show a little bit of the work that Whitney did on it, but one of the topics I wanted to talk about was empowering the people that I was working with to actually become ambassadors for the project and develop pride for the project. So, on that note, I'm going to show them talking about the game a little bit.
Well, sometimes I have to clean the kitchen, so I do that from time to time. But no, in all honesty, I'm a level designer at Compulsion Games, and what I do is it's a lot of things actually, because Compulsion's such a small team, we wear a lot of hats. So I'll do everything from the initial layouts up to blocking out, to level scripting, to integrating audio, all sorts of stuff. But it's all fun, and it's kind of cool because you get to do a lot more than you probably would. Well, no, you do get to do a lot more than you would at a bigger studio. So.
Alright, so I mean, Comcast has some pretty unique tasks. Can you go on a little bit about how it works?
Yeah, I'm running out of power.
Well, essentially, working with those mechanics and
Okay. I'm sure Josh is really happy to see himself on screen. Oh, you're wearing the same shirt. So, I mean, this is one of the things that, for me, was really, really important, is that the people that were on the team really felt like they were engaged at a level that, no, it's the wrong one, it's the really bad one.
No.
That the people who were working on the team felt really, really engaged in the team. And for me, it was a slow building of the confidence of each team member that was actually participating in the team. And building a really strong corporate culture is not something you can build overnight. People think that you can just build corporate culture overnight, but that's not true. It takes time. It takes time, and it takes the participation of the team. You can't have one person saying how everything's going to be run and how the culture is going to be. The culture comes from the people on the team just as much as it comes from the person running the team. So, on my front, the biggest thing that I did is I sent my I helped send the staff that was working with me to conferences and pitch the game. I put them in front of cameras. Both Whitney and Josh were in front of cameras for the media interviews. And I made sure that there was an understanding within the team that when people were working, they would have the time to love the craft and love the work that they did, to succeed at what they did, but at the same time, the end product and their common work was the most important thing. And I call that building a culture of success. And you can tell it, it's not about, you know, people going, boom, 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 look how awesome am I, we're the best team in the, no, it's about how willing they're willing to go out of their ways to actually make a team effort work. And I'm really proud to say that I think at this juncture, after the first project that we've shipped, we've gotten to that stage where the team is jailed and is functioning, which is something that was really difficult to accomplish on the first title because I started by myself in my basement with $30,000. And I had to slowly kind of accumulate a team and slowly create a team culture through it. So I'll restart my computer while I talk. I'm almost done, by the way, for you guys who are wanting to go for a beer. I did want to say, I'm really proud of Toronto. I really am. Like, I mean this. You know, you guys, you know, when I left in 2007, I thought everything was going great at Pseudo. When Pseudo closed, I was a little bit disheartened because we'd seen a number of large independent studio closures. And I didn't know what was going to happen with Toronto. And I heard of Cappy in France, actually.
And then try to develop a whole new skill set around this new mechanic.
Just speaking again.
There's no books telling you how to do multi-dimensional puzzle platformers. There's lots to show you how to make an FPS or something like that. But yeah, this took a totally new mindset where everything had to essentially be developed with a basic idea, but in real time. So we had to build this stuff out and really get in the engine, playing with the mechanic, and seeing what happened.
Do you want to talk a bit about how the process works, like designing puzzles in the context?
No, I also show Whitney. Yes, I will. So Whitney hates cameras. She's not comfortable in front of cameras. She's like me. She's going to kill me for showing this. But the beauty about it is you can see that she's way more genuine because of it, actually. So, and this is a little bit what I was talking about earlier.
Compliment the shadow mechanic.
Which is that sometimes when you're really uncomfortable, you actually come out as way more genuine than other people who are super slick about their pitch.
Nice. So, different genres that use shadows were film noir and German expressionism. So we wanted to come up with an original world that would meld the two together. So we chose film noir because the storytelling in shadows is really expressive and dramatic, and our characters kind of fit a lot of the film noir archetypes. For example, Kat is a sexy femme fatale-like figure. And there's a lot of drama that happens, so it's kind of like a classic film noir story arc. But we didn't want the game to feel like it was in the 40s, because that's been done a lot. And so we wanted to come up with a world that was unique and original and could also meld a bunch of these influences. So that's why we chose the setting to be the 20s, because we loved the artistic decadence that the 20s had, and we loved the vaudeville influence in the 20s with the performing arts, so circuses, burlesque shows, so we thought it would be really interesting to meld the two together, and it ended up looking really awesome. So that was
This is my favorite part.
So yeah. So the 20s influence was
It's really bad.
I was like, I got into it a little bit.
Whitney, you're awesome. All right, so, and this is, I'll show you another picture. This is also also Sam on the Sony stage at Gamescom in front of 1,000 journalists. So we got a lot of, we did get a lot of attention on the project, and we're really thankful for the various people that helped bring it to light. I didn't imagine when I started this in my basement that there'd be, close to 2 million people playing it. So for us, it's the first studio. I mean, again, we've grown from nothing to thriving studio over the last 5 years, and the first 3 years were a little bit of a slog, and then we finally got into production to making Contrast. I'll show you the launch trailer, so that if there are people in the room who have absolutely no idea what I've been talking about so far, you'll actually get a little bit of a sense for it.
Mommy, is Daddy ever coming back?
I don't know, honey. Maybe someday when he's ready. But don't you worry. Mommy always comes back.
I think sometimes she doesn't tell the truth. Come on, we're gonna be late for the show.
I wanna come home, Daddy.
No, Johnny. Not again. You're a carousel of broken dreams.
See? You meet a guy's wife, now he's got a whole new reason to make good. Ladies and gentlemen, a physicist named Albert Einstein at the University of Berlin tells us that our universe may not be the only one.
I missed you so much.
But in this world of shadows, what seems familiar may be dangerous. What you don't know can hurt you.
Get back.
You would never lie to me, would you?
All right, so, I mean, thank you. Again, the game would have never happened if we weren't really, really careful about respecting everyone's craft. Because that in turn made everyone contribute at the same level. We have folks from Pixelnots who now running their own studio who did our art. Now they're running their own game, their own studio. Same for the sound, same for the team members. Is really the idea that we would give the space for each person to succeed in their craft. Closing points: control your business. And by controlling your business, that means have enough money to control your business, or figure out a way that you can actually have a safety net so you can actually allow yourself to take risks, allow yourself to fail, and create the right team culture. And at the end of the day, when you're successful and you're buying your yachts, well, pay it forward to the other starting, indie studios that are starting out. Thank you very much.